Welcome back to anybody who was here with us last week, and welcome to anybody who is joining us for the first time. My name is Samantha Hardingham. I am the LSA's academic director and have the privilege of hosting these talks every week, as I am pleased to tell everyone it is my favourite bit of the week. So we will commence, I think, without further ado. I think everybody is pretty prompt these days of coming in, and we want to make the best of our lunchtime. So while you are all eating your lunch, we will today be hearing from our very own Neal Shasore. For those of us who joined last week, we launched the series with really in memory of the late and great Michael Hopkins, Michael being one half of the gold medal winning team of Michael and Patty Hopkins, who just so profoundly shaped our 20th and 21st century city. Heard from Mike Taylor there on 100 Liverpool Street, a phenomenal, huge project for Broadgate that is now one can go and visit. And in fact, he encouraged everybody to go and see the building and actually go into the building, which seemingly looks rather private, but in fact has quite a big public element to it. So hope everybody has done that, and if not, do it. As I said, this week, Neal is with us. Neal is not coming to you as head of school. He is coming to you as Neal Shasore. Neal Shasore as architectural historian by training, a researcher, writer, primarily focused on architectural culture in Britain and the Empire in the first half of the 20th century, and really is going to offer us some critical perspectives that have informed both his own pedagogy and practice. Neal has recently published two incredible books, incredible largely because the titles in themselves are incredible. So I will try to. There's no abbreviation to these, but you can show them. Thank you, Neal. Designs on Democracy, Architecture and the Public in Interwar London, and Reconstruction, Architecture, Society, and the Aftermath of the First World War. So light reading, both of which have been recently shortlisted for the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain's awards. So I'm glad to see, Neal, you're in good company, having been a recent recipient of one of their awards. Thank you very much. Incredible pieces of writing and research, long projects. Can't believe at such an early point in a career to have achieved so much, in fact, but really, I guess Neal will tell us what he's really going to focus on, I think. But I suspect it will be something around reflections on formative moments in the formation of the modern architectural profession and how historic insights might help to shape its future. Particular focus on 1920s and 30s, a pivotal period in what is known as the Boring Revolution, which birthed the modern architect and the social infrastructure of the proto-welfare state. So meaty subject for a lunchtime. Hope you all have good lunches in front of you. This is, I suppose, slightly atypical to some of the other talks in our series. We often hear from members of our practice network really focus on particular built projects or projects that are on the table or in the computer or in production. So I'd say this is much more around architectural culture or a perspective on what the other ingredients that make up our architectural culture. And I'm really pleased that the series is kind of extending into that realm. Just for those, a quick flag, and I'll say it again at the end. Next week, we are welcoming Christophe Aigret, and I'll say a little bit more about at the end of our session today. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Neal. Thank you so much, Neal, for agreeing to do this in what is a very, very busy schedule. But hopefully a highlight to your week.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sam. Very nice to not see you all, but I feel your presence, all 34 of you. And as Sam says, hope you're enjoying your lunch. So I called this talk "The Past in the Future." I was riffing off Sir John Summerson, the great architectural historian, who wrote an essay called "The Past in the Present," published in a volume called "Heavenly Mansions," in which he reflected on essentially on what were the kind of foundational criteria of statutory listing, obscurely. Anyway, I'll come back to that later on. I'm going to share some slides. I've got too many slides, and I'm going to go through them at some pace, but I'll dwell on this first, just the logos of the Future Architects Front and the section of architectural workers. And of course, I'm very, very pleased that Charlie Edmonds from FAF has joined our faculty as a tutor in critical practice. But this seemed to me quite a good example of the ways in which the past could inform the future, and probably in a way that currently it isn't. The new president of the RIBA, Moiwa Oki, was elected on a platform driven partly by a Future Architects Front and the section of architectural workers. And this represents, I suppose, a significant moment in the representation of architectural workers. But one of the things I'm really interested in is what's the history of that? What's the history of the role of the RIBA president? What have people thought it's about? And what has been the kind of longer history of labour representation within the architectural profession and across the wider built environment? And I think quite typically, and this is no criticism at all, Future Architects Front, dare I say it, Moiwa, are not necessarily aware of the ways in which their achievement, and I think it is an achievement, sits within a longer arc. And actually, if you're trying to sustain change or further catalyze change, for me as a historian, I think it's really important to understand how that's worked or hasn't worked previously. It's a really fundamental way of informing and making more critical your own positions. And certainly for those in our first year cohort, I think that's a very important lesson for you to bear in mind as you start to develop your own critical practice manuals and manifestos over the coming months. Because in fact, this whole idea of the role of the RIBA president has changed, right? Until the 1980s, there was only one RIBA presidential election in 1924. Otherwise, the president tended to be elected by the council and tended to be a vice president of the institute. Now, we can debate as to whether we think that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but every time there's a presidential election, and you may well have trumpeted this statistic yourself, people say, oh, well, only 7% of the membership actually voted for the president, suggesting that there was once upon a time when there was some great mass democratic exercise to elect the president of the institute, to elect the representative of the profession. Simply not true. In fact, there were moments of profound reform when the democratization of the election of council and of the president kind of came through. And often that was interlinked with agitation about representation of architectural workers. You can go right back to the founding of the Institute in 1834. There had been several abortive attempts to set up a kind of architectural society. So why 1834? One of the things I'm very interested in is that in 1834, when the liberal bourgeois profession finally gets its act together to organize into something called the Institute of British Architects, which, whether we like it or not, has been an enduring institution, it finally gets its act together the very same year of the General Consolidated Trades Union, which had significant representation of workers in the building industry, right? So this tension between the professional and the worker is almost originary to the ideal of professionalism. So taking that critical viewpoint, I think, is important. And certainly by the time you get to my period in the 1920s, when you have something like the AASTA, the Association of Architectural and Surveying and Technical Workers, you get much more aggressive unionization within the architectural profession. And that continues into an organization in the post-war years called the ABT. You also have the National Federation of Building Trades Operatives. So there's a really lively tradition, actually, of labor agitation, representation of salaried architects, of what were called official architects working in large commercial entities or in governmental bodies and agencies. That's actually a really important story, a relatively untold story in the history of the formation of the modern architectural professional. And incidentally, one of the things I would really like to do with Charlie and Future Architects Front, and indeed the section of architectural workers, if they're keen, is to convene a set of discussions, actually, which place this contemporary moment within that longer arc. If we're going to do what everyone seems to say that we want to do, which is to support our new president, Moiwa Oki, in this transformative, change-making mission on which he's embarked. If we don't critically engage with that history, I think we will struggle actually for this to embed any meaningful or lasting change. So just wanted to kind of blast open, I suppose, that way of thinking. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these books that I've written and try to connect how these books and the projects that led to them, which, you know, were deeply unfashionable when I embarked on them over 10 years ago, have very oddly sort of lived with me over that decade-long period and have informed, sometimes in quite surprising ways, my wider practice, both as a teacher, but also running and I hope pushing forward this extraordinary institution, which many of us on this call are part of. I'm just going to sort of set the scene, I suppose, and just think about how, you know, the 1920s and 30s, certainly in British architectural history, it's often felt to be quite a dull subject. I'm not sure whether my books will persuade anyone that that's not the case, but the mainstream of architectural production and design at that period often is felt to be much less interesting than the burgeoning modernist movement and the kind of avant-garde of design, the Bauhaus, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and so on, all those kind of heroes of the modern movement, which I know certainly our first years have started to challenge, started to problematize through some of the lectures that you've had with James Sohn over the last couple of weeks. But quite a lot of the social infrastructure or its material or spatial manifestations was indeed forged during this period. I'm showing you now the general post office's design for a telephone kiosk, designed by an architect, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, who designed Liverpool Cathedral and some other buildings we'll see in a moment. And this was a really important, as we know, for a while, ubiquitous part of our streetscape, derived from a design of the mausoleum of Sir John Soane's wife in St Pancras Old Church churchyard. You have things like the electricity pylon, which we know sort of tramps through both the urban and rural landscape, produced by the Central Electricity Board as they developed the national grid. Sir Reginald Bloomfield, the great Edwardian grandee consulting architect, contributed to the design of those pylons. The architecture of power, another building by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, Battersea Power Station A and B, now of course reinvented by Wilkinson Eyre. You had agitation around the sprawl, urban sprawl, and in particular suburban sprawl, this famous book, England and the Octopus by Clough Williams Ellis, and some aerial photographs. Of course, the whole technology of aerial photography was new in the 1920s, showing that sprawl of light industry alongside new arterial roads, and then attendant speculative private housing development, which was felt almost to choke up the landscape. This, a picture not from England and the Octopus, but another book by Clough Williams Ellis called Britain and the Beast, showing our new Great West Road, this incredible bit of infrastructure carving through the landscape, and what has become of it. The same section before and after strangulation by ribbon building. I think that's a really interesting provocation. Buildings like this one on the left. This was the headquarters of what was originally the Underground Electric Railway Company, later the London Passenger Transport Board. You know it now as TfL. And this was a really important period in the formation of the London Underground, part of, or exemplary, I should say, of an organisation called the Design and Industries Association, which argued for a closer alliance between design, including architectural design, and industry, but industry not just meaning manufacture, but also the kind of new and burgeoning public services, including ones such as mass transportation. And then on the right, Senate House. These are projects both by the architect Charles Holden. Senate House, the nucleus of the University of London. There were modernists active at this time. I'm showing you High Point in Highgate by Lebetkin's Tecton, Willow Road by Erno Goldfinger. You had people like Eric Mendelsohn in his day, probably the most famous modernist architecture, certainly more famous than Le Corbusier to British audiences in 1930, when he first visited the UK and gave a talk to the AA, and this is an invitation to that talk on the right. Or often colonial sons. This is the Canadian Wells Coates, born in Tokyo, who designed the Lawn Road flats, now known as the Isakon flats in Hampstead, shown on the right there. Some of his interiors shown here. Reginald Uren's Hornsey Town Hall, currently being converted into a hotel, felt to be the first, or often proclaimed as the first, modernist town hall in England. This private house for the Cambridge Don, Mansfield Forbes, designed by Raymond McGrath, about which my friend and colleague Elizabeth Darling has written extensively. This was a really important kind of salon space for figuring out what British modernism might do. We'll come back to Mansfield Forbes probably a little bit later. Serge Tremaillov with Eric Mendelsohn, and a view of their spiral staircase at the Delaware Pavilion. Don't ever be confused or bullied into saying Delaware. It's the Delaware Pavilion at Bexhill. There were women. This is a cover of a book by Elizabeth Darling and Lynn Walker, showing that women were admitted to the AA from 1917. Sam, I know when she was at the AA, was very supportive of this pioneering exhibition, and women coming also from colonial settings and studying. Jane Drew and Max Fry, Elizabeth Scott, Sir Giles's cousin, who designed the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford upon Avon. So you start to get the entry of women into the profession at this time too. Modernism and modernists consolidated into something called the Modern Architecture Research Group, or MARS Group, established in 1933. And you can see members of that group. There's Max Fry, there's Wells Coates, and so on, with Le Corbusier attending their exhibition, I think in 1935. These are some images of that pioneering exhibition on modernist architecture in England. And you start to get new spaces also of broadcasting, the new technology of broadcasting, the British Broadcasting Company, established in 1922, which became the British Broadcasting Corporation just a few years later. And this project completed in 1932, Broadcasting House, still the headquarters of the BBC on Portland Place. Its exterior designed by a very pedestrian architect, Lieutenant Colonel George Val Meyer, but fitted. And you can see the structure, essentially a sort of steel frame building for the kind of outer ring, and then a kind of sort of brick core for additional acoustic insulation, then packed full of studios, which were designed by young avant-garde architects like Wells Coates, like Raymond McGrath, who designed these new spaces of transmission. And again, Elizabeth Darling is doing lots of interesting work about that too. But this was also a place in which radical ideas about architecture in the built environment were being disseminated. And there's a brilliant book by a woman called Shundana Yusuf called Broadcasting Buildings, showing how radio became a really important medium for the dissemination of architectural ideas at this time. So that's a kind of broader context. That was happening. That's what was happening in the world of architecture and design in the 1920s and 30s. And my intervention, which we'll talk a little bit about now, was really to take a more critical view, certainly of the mainstream of architectural production, and to look at the kind of formation of what I call a liberal consensus around a certain professional ideal. And as Sam said, this was a moment of what Indy Johar at Dark Matter Labs describes now, or calls for now, as a boring revolution, in which the kind of dark matter, the kind of institutional infrastructure was being invented or reinvented, in particular to suit the needs or newly articulated needs of a mass democracy. Because, of course, coming out of the First World War, we secure by 1928 universal suffrage, i.e. all men and women achieving the vote, but also the reduction of the working week such that people have more time for recreation, a changing conception of the public, of the mass democracy, not as a threat, but as an energy that needs to be harnessed, because if you didn't, you ran the risk of potentially violent revolution and upheaval, as had been seen, for example, in Russia. And architects, as with many sections of society coming out of the war, and in fact during the war, started to think about how they were going to meet these newly articulated demands of the mass democracy. Because if they didn't, having been the hand servants of capital for so long, and also of church and of crown, they might lose their relevance. And not only their relevance, but also their privilege. Because, of course, architects, like all professionals, received and continue to receive particular privileges in exchange for almost a kind of monopolistic control over what it is that they can or can't do, their service to the public. So this book, Designs on Democracy, which came out last year, I don't want to fool you, it is quite thick, was the first kind of foray into this subject. And then I also was working on a second book, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, called Reconstruction. And then I'm writing a new history of 66 Portland Place, which will be the kind of new official history of that building, the headquarters of the RIBA. And certainly for those LSA students, I know Sam is working doggedly to make sure I can take you round there in the next few weeks. The cover, which I think is an amazing cover, uses this wonderful image by the engraver and etcher Raymond Myerscough Walker, who worked for the architect of this building, Gray Wernham, showing the building from its interior just as it was being completed in 1934. And the reason I chose it was not only because the RIBA, in a sense, is the center of architectural culture at this time, but I thought that this image kind of conveyed, the scraper-board image conveyed perfectly the double meaning of the title. To have designs on something is to seek to co-opt something for your own ends. So when I say designs on democracy, yes, it's about the ways in which architects sought to engage with the mass democracy, but it's also about how rhetorically they sought to co-opt, almost to harness that energy for their own benefit. And these kind of huddled conspiratorial figures on these scaffolding stages, I thought conveyed that rather well. The book comprises a very long introduction, 5 chapters, and then an extremely long conclusion. It's the chapters each take a word that was kind of frequently heard in the architectural discourse of the time, but which you don't necessarily think of as architectural ideas or architectural words. The introduction about the reconstructing the profession for a democratic age. It lands at the AA in 1930 when Eric Mendelsohn came to give this lecture about the new modern architecture and how that was kind of received by this very elite culture of architects, which I think I possibly showed this image the other day to our first years. And I think this sort of summarizes brilliantly the kind of monoculture of architecture at that time. I'm also very keen on this image by an architect called John Murray in response to a survey, a questionnaire that the RIBA issued in 1917 about what the future of architecture should be. And this is a really kind of interesting spatialization of one architect's vision of what the future of architecture might be. And note this conception of the union of the art of architecture and the allied sciences and arts, showing the RIBA at the middle of this kind of tholos, this almost kind of temple structure, surrounded by, this heavy phrase, the art of architecture, BC 6000. And then all these kind of attendant institutions, the Arts and Crafts Society, the London Society, the Quantity Surveyors Association, the Royal Sanitary Institute, the Concrete Institute, the British Fire Prevention Committee, that of course really reflects the ways in which professionals thought of their practice, and the ways in which that we write that history often fails to capture that diversity of practice. And what I hope that the book does is start to introduce ways in which you can write back in that diversity. The first substantive chapter is called Propaganda. It's about publicity and the arts of display at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, which was a huge international exhibition. 17 million people attended in its first season, which ran from St. George's Day in 1924 to the middle of 1925, and then for a second season up until 1926. And these two images by the designer F.C. Herrick show the ways in which kind of graphic design and commercial arts was also bound up in the Empire exhibition. It birthed Wembley Stadium and the iconic Twin Towers, replaced by the current structure about 15 years ago. And I got particularly interested in these two massive concrete hangars, the Palace of Industry and the Palace of Arts, which were controlled by a very interesting figure called Lawrence Weaver, who'd been architectural editor of Country Life for many years and promoted a number of young architects to kind of produce the architectural design for those spaces. So designed a number of the temporary pavilions. It had, of course, highly problematic aspects. There was what were called the races in residence or native villages, where Africans were often kind of incongruous tribes with styles of architecture from completely different parts of Africa, essentially lived on the exhibition site to be gawped at. And these were captured in some of the posters by artists like Spencer Price. And I'm really interested in what the Empire exhibition, again, might tell us about the current state of design and its future. So leading up to the centenary of the Empire exhibition in 2024, so next year, I'm trying to get a big project off the ground for us to start to think about what lessons the Empire exhibition might hold about the present and future of Brent, where Wembley still is, and what it might tell us about the implication and complicity of architecture, design, and craft in inequitable systems of supply and global trade, and how we could use this case study to inform more equitable cultural policy. So we're working with the British Council on that. And we very much want to take a kind of decolonial approach in which we're really engaging with scholars, curators, designers, makers who have engaged with traces, histories, narratives, and memories of the Empire exhibition from a non-Western, non-English, and non-Eurocentric point of view. I'll skip ahead a bit, but these are just some pavilions at the Empire exhibition. The second chapter is about architecture and the building industry at the time of economic turbulence. So again, what happens to architecture? What happens to the production of the built environment during periods of economic turbulence? Well, that, of course, has massive relevance to the moment that we find ourselves in now. And there are lessons to be learned from 1929, the Wall Street crash, and its implications on the UK economy, where the Great Depression was known here as the slump, which affected disproportionately the construction industry and thereby architectural practice, flinging hundreds, if not thousands, of architects out of work and leading to an extremely abrupt cessation of a number of capital projects, including infrastructure, but also architectural design projects. So I got very interested in how this moment of profound crisis actually generated new ways of kind of corporate cooperation across the construction industry, and essentially created the modern institutions of sectoral and governmental lobbying. And so this extremely interesting organization, the Building Industries National Council, came into being to lobby against economic retrenchment and for kind of Keynesian investment in capital projects at the time of economic depression. This is just a nice drawing of J.M. Keynes. And my story begins actually with the opening of this building. You can still see the tower at Baker Street. This was the extension to what was called the Abbey Road Building Society. You might know it as Abbey National before it became Santander. Designed by the great commercial architect of his day, Delisa Joseph. And when the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, came to open this building, he essentially advocated for essentially spending wisely and investing in capital projects and architectural projects. And this was one of the stimuluses for the establishment of the Building Industries National Council. The third chapter deals with this idea of machine craft. It's about forging public institutions. And machine craft, I think, is a fascinating word, because I started off by saying the ways in which, there tends to be a kind of dismissal of what's happening in England and in Britain in the 1920s and 30s as, terribly parochial and kind of unaware of the innovations happening in Germany, in Dessau, at the Bauhaus, and so on. But actually, machine craft was a phrase coined by a very interesting writer about architecture and about furniture called John Gloag, to capture precisely what the Bauhaus were also doing and what Svenska Form were doing in Scandinavia, and in particular in Sweden, which was to advocate for taking advantage of the innovations that mechanization could bring, whilst retaining and engaging with craft and making and the kind of human richness of those experiences. And I was at a dinner last night where we were talking about the implications, for example, of AI on design and on architectural education and education more broadly. And I think, again, this question is still at the forefront of our minds. So what insight could we gain from thinking about other moments of rapid industrialization and mechanization? And what lessons might there be for us to learn about how we integrate that with a culture, with a society that remains fundamentally humane and engages with the haptic, that engages with a very rich tradition of making? And indeed, how do we marry the possibilities of high technology with what we still value in low technology? I think those are really urgent and relevant questions that you should be exploring, certainly those students of ours at the LSA, not only in first year, and some of you will be doing this through a think tank with Weston Williamson, but also in your thesis projects into fifth year. My case study for this idea or ideal of machine craft is, oddly enough, the RIBA headquarters, number 66 Portland Place, which is exemplary of this integration of the latest technology, a steel frame building with high-tech lighting. You can see from this image that flood lighting was integrated right from the start, new technologies for the designing of walls. It was an all-electric building, still a rarity in the 1930s, supplied by the local authorities, electricity supplied by the Marylebone Electrical Company, but which integrates craft. These extraordinary bronze doors, which you can see here to Portland Place, sculptural ornamentation, etc., etc. And which is also about empire. Empire timbers are used extensively throughout the building. The Dominion screen carved in Quebec pine, flooring of Indian silver grey wood, but a building also that owed much to the Stockholm Concerthuset, the concert hall designed by the architect Ivar Tengbom, and there's a real kind of typological precedent, I think. And a building that owed much to the formation of another new institution formed in 1932 called the Building Centre. Still exists now on Store Street, originally on New Bond Street, which showcased the latest technologies in design and in building, and in which the architect Gray Wernham was involved and learned a lot from this building and let it inform the specification of 66 Portland Place. I'm running rapidly out of time, so I'm going to keep moving. The next chapter, Vigilance, Preservationism and a Proprietary Public. Well, you know, a number of you in your interviews to join the course talked about the fact that, you know, in a climate emergency, we need to stop building. We're all conservation architects now. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at, again, some of these formative moments and formation of orthodoxies in the way that we treat the historic environment. And I got particularly interested in a story about a working class suburb of London on the peripheries of St John's Wood called Portland Town. And this article, which featured in the Architectural Review, in 1936, written by a guy called Ralph Parker, who was a communist who then defected to the Soviet Union and died in the Soviet Union a couple of decades later. So that's quite interesting that you've got a communist writer writing for the Architectural Review, getting involved in a campaign to preserve these early 19th century artisanal cottages from commercial development, primarily for middle-class flats, to replace this. And part of the argument was about not just the architectural value of these buildings, which was actually relatively little. They were kind of bog standard, small artisanal cottages, but actually about the erosion of social life. So there was an argument, in other words, about social sustainability at precisely the moment that another faction within the preservationist movement wins out and says, actually, no, all we're trying to do is protect grand buildings from being demolished. And that was an organization called the Georgian Group, who then lobbied successfully for what we now call statutory listing, which was instigated in the 1944 and 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, but which, as I say, had been agitated for by members of the Georgian Group through something called the Architectural Amenities Bill in 1939. So these were some of those working class cottages. And as I say, there was an organization set up called the Londoners' League who argued for the preservation of London, architectural, horticultural, and sociological, that were arguing against the heavy-handedness of the nascent discipline of town planning to eradicate swathes of the city, often for very good political or socio-political motives, but which was forgetting about the richness of the social lives of these places. And again, I think, you know, that's a debate that we're having now, that Create Streets are mounting, that, you know, is very much gaining the ear of certain policymakers. Ensuring that we have a nuanced understanding of what was underpinning those debates is really important. And these extraordinary documentary photographs, which were reproduced in the Architectural Review by the documentary photographer Margaret Monk, really, really interesting moment, I think, and unusual to feature, I think you'd agree, in an architectural magazine in the late 1930s. The next chapter is about the early history of low-rise high-density housing. definitely lessons to learn there. I was talking to Bob Allies the other day about Tristan Edwards and what lessons there might be for contemporary urbanism. This rather strange character, and I'll talk to you about him at greater length another time, who completely against the orthodoxies of the day advocated for low-rise, high-density housing, advocated for working class communities not to have all their homes kind of destroyed and for them to kind of be socially engineered out of the city, but argued passionately for the retention of existing low-rise, high-density housing stock in cities, and advocated very aggressively for compact new towns through this vehicle called 100 New Towns for Britain, and came up with this idea of a kind of model town plan, zoned, as was fairly conventional, but the densities that he was proposing and the kind of morphologies and the detail of those morphologies, I think really, really interesting. This kind of Neo-Georgian stucco-faced vocabulary, very interested in this idea of manners, of how buildings should show good manners to one another. Was very much an idea that he propagated in a famous book of the day called Good and Bad Manners in Architecture. And then I'll just quickly whiz through the final chapter, which is definitely a story for another day, but about how these kind of these newly felt obligations to the public were projected intensely in public discourse onto the site that we now know as the South Bank. And it oriented in particular around the fate of the old Waterloo Bridge. This is an image of Herbert Morrison, the great Labour leader of the London County Council, literally prizing off the first blocks of old Waterloo Bridge in order to make way for some new infrastructure. This was partly because old Waterloo Bridge was sinking, this extraordinary photograph of a man wobbling a bit of balustrading. The way in which it was demolished is definitely a story for another day, but just these incredible images of how Waterloo Bridge was sort of unbuilt, block by block, and then brick by brick, leaving, just as one newspaper evocatively wrote, the 7 sentinels for the kind of 7 piers of the river, until they themselves were kind of nibbled away and shipped to Harmondsworth, where oddly there's still huge amounts of the kind of bits and bobs of Waterloo Bridge scattered around, and then replaced by the Waterloo Bridge that we now know and some people love, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott. And then about the Hungerford Railway Bridge and the kind of remaking, as you can see in these images, of and kind of reordering of infrastructure and public realm. And there were literally hundreds of schemes and literally constant public debate, not just by architects, but by society about what to do with this space. It was a very unusual moment of kind of loud and constant discussion about the shaping and reshaping of the built environment. Very quickly, before Sam stops me, I thought I'd just talk about Reconstruction, Architecture, Society in the Aftermath of the First World War. And this is an edited volume with my friend Dr. Jessica Kelly, and maybe we'll get her in to talk more about this book. But there are 15 contributors all talking about the kind of new social infrastructure that was created in the aftermath of the First World War. And I was reading just this morning in The Guardian about how since 2010, since the Conservative-led coalition government of 2010, how many billions of pounds of that social infrastructure has been sold off by public bodies and local authorities because of a funding shortfall. And how, again, this eradication of the social infrastructure, often of typologies and of urbanities, which you, our students, then start to redesign speculatively through your thesis projects. And therefore how this moment of the creation of that infrastructure probably needs re-examining. This is a moment, for example, in which you have the birth of the community centre. And so we have a section called Designing Community Infrastructure, the birth of the modern pub this one of the first retrofitted pubs in Carlisle, the Gretna Tavern, one of the first improved pubs. And this one here, the Apple Tree, designed by an architect. Pubs had not really been designed by architects, except with very few exceptions. In the 19th century, we had all these plans redrawn. How the formation of parochial church councils started to determine the very design of religious buildings in the newly expanded suburbs to cater to the Christian communities as the Anglican Church started to worry about the growing secularization of society. We talk about building a rural citizenry, the new yeoman and the land settlement scheme, in which returning soldiers were given small pockets of land to cultivate. How non-architects like the housing activist Annabel Dott started to design housing to support disabled ex-servicemen. About adult education and the village college movement, culminating in Impington by Walter Gropius, that plan on the right. On binding subjects through statecraft, town halls, this Swansea Guildhall by Percy Thomas, new forms of liberal governmentality, of Rhodes House in Oxford, designed by Herbert Baker, bound up in Cecil Rhodes's kind of liberal vision of Anglo-American white supremacy and liberal subjectivity, of healthcare. We finished this book during COVID, the idea of a health centre and its reality, including provincial hospitals, this article by Barry Doyle, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop there. I had a whole other story about Norwich City Hall, but I'll have to tease you with that, and we'll come back to that in another talk at some point in the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Neal. Just an incredible, well, what a lunch. I hope everybody has been able to digest, both in the mind and the stomach. You've covered an extraordinary range of subject matter, relatively tight time span, but crikey, what an era. What a couple of decades, actually, in terms of activity, architecturally and just globally. You cover everything from culture and communications, economy, technology, society at large, housing, all manner of versions of what we all deal with in the architectural discourse that we're all in various sort of sections. And I'm going to use the last sort of 15 minutes, little less, 13 minutes to be exact, to remind everybody, I'm sorry, I'm sort of already defaulting into, I expect you will know the routine by now, but please do put your questions in the chat. Anybody who has questions, please don't hesitate to put them in. So while you're thinking about questions, and do not be afraid, anything really, just put it in there. Even if it's a request to have 5 more talks on picking out each one of these subject matters in more detail, please start putting them in there. In the meantime, while we're waiting, I guess I'm particularly interested in this context, Neal, in terms of your process of making this work. To me, because I think very much in an editorial way and through portfolio as a body of work, how do you bring such a huge body of work together in a meaningful way that communicates, that distills both the language of the time and the period of time that you're working with and the range of material that you're working with, develop a vocabulary that sort of communicates and distills some of that time, but that also allows to, which is what you've done, I think, very successfully, allows us to kind of start to imagine how one might use that material in future projects. So I just wonder, and I think that very last thing you touched on about births of new typologies, you know, and very much that period of time being the moment where there is the beginning of so much newness. And that's exactly what our students are doing, is thinking about the new typologies of now. How, in probably about 3 sentences. How do you start to do that how do you start to work on that process? Connect very big, enormous ranges of material and start to sort of distill a vocabulary for yourself that communicates and starts to kind of pull visual material and textual material together?
It's a good question. I think for me, well, the way that this project started was with a PhD. And the PhD I set out to do is not the PhD that I wrote. And one of the privileges of postgraduate education, all of you guys, is an ability to kind of follow your nose. So for me, a lot of the early work was just sort of opening your eyes and following your nose. All this stuff seems to connect. And I must say that it's only kind of, nearly 2 years after finishing these projects that I see their breadth. I used to think, oh God, this is all kind of just about one thing and it just repeats itself all the time. And it's only now that I'm saying, oh God, no, you're going across a whole range of typologies, of scales, of moments. And so I think immersion is really important. And certainly one of the ways that I work in that immersive way is to really listen to the language and the tenor and the tone. And that's why all of the titles that I use in the chapters, for example, are literally words that you hear all the time in the architectural press at that moment. And then to think, but that's kind of counterintuitive because we don't think of vigilance as an architectural word, right? But actually, it's a word that is constantly used. If you leaf the pages of any architectural journal at that time, they're constantly talking about vigilance, or the metaphor of vigilance, about manners, about propaganda. So you listen really carefully. And then also, because I'm a trained art historian, to not ever use images as merely illustrations, but to interrogate all forms of visual culture, from the drawing, to photograph, to film. I used film in some cases also. All aspects of visual culture, to really understand that and immerse yourself in that context. And that, I think, allows you to more effectively synthesize and, as you say, form that kind of vocabulary. In terms of how it then connects to sort of things that are current, well, I got lucky in some regards, which is that as I was finishing my doctorate, I ran out of money. And so I took a job at the RIBA. And a job in the practice department of the RIBA, which is not a natural place for a historian to work. You might assume I want to work in the library or in the collections team. And that showed me and alarmed me that a lot of the discussions and questions that I was observing and kind of interested in abstractly in the 20s and 30s were highly pertinent to the discussions that we were having about practice and professionalism in the 2010s and now in the 2020s. So really being alert, I think, folks, to why your work matters, what relevance it might have to bigger questions is really important. And I think that as my practice, my research has matured, it's that ability to connect to what's happening now that is really valuable.
That's really interesting. And I wonder, I mean, it's very that you find that process is one that opens up and it grows, and that it is unpredictable, and it goes in directions you never knew it was going to go in, because how could you possibly know that? If you knew it, you probably wouldn't do it, or you certainly probably wouldn't start. So that not knowing is a really critical bit, I would say, of that process. And then the sort of unlikely trajectories that this goes in. I mean, one sort of incidental one, in a couple of weeks' time, I will talk and with another architect, another young architect from the Netherlands, about some of my work on Cedric Price, and then where this young architect has taken that work, or that some of that thinking. And then my own connection back from Price to Tristan Edwards. I mean, that was my introduction to Edwards, was Cedric thought his description of the arts and the sort of order of the arts that was always commonly known that the architecture was the mother of all arts, and Tristan Edwards said, no, hang on a minute, no, it's human
cultivation of human beauty.
cultivation of human beauty. And Cedric applauded that, the idea that you put humans first and architecture much further down the pile. So, these unlikely links that actually then also span generations and ways of thinking about many of these topics. So I suppose it's my also, out there, keep alert to unusual bedfellows or where there are connections in architecture that you might not think they may lie, because on the face of it, they don't seem to stylistically connect or otherwise, but it goes much, much deeper than that. So I think I'm pleased that there are these sort of this network is growing. I'm looking in the chat. We have 5 minutes to go. I have a couple of questions from our very own Zafir. So I might just put those out to you. You started, Neal, with FAF, Future Architect, and SAW. How would you apply lessons from history to amplify or enhance the work that they do?
Well, I suppose my point is I don't yet know. So I think we should convene some discussions here at the LSA about other moments of Labour struggles, what has limited their success, or what achievements that they made, so that we can build more consciously on those, so that we're not, as it were, falling into perhaps some familiar mistakes. I mean, incidentally, my concern always with the discussion about Labour in architecture is that we've got to be looking more broadly at the construction industry more widely. And I think that there are fundamental tensions between the professional ideal and unionism that are possibly irreconcilable. And therefore, what we might be agitating for is a very different industrial formation in construction. And I think that as the climate emergency becomes more acute and our economy starts to evolve, this is a very good moment, I think, again, to revisit other attempts at more fundamental industrial reform. And again, for me, that grows out of the 19th century Guild Socialist movement, the building parliaments in the post-war years that have a direct link to the formation of the National Federation of Building Trades Operatives, which eventually absorbs a lot of the energy of ASTA and the ABT. There's work to be done there, I think. And of course, amazing work already being done by people like Probe, by Linda Clark and Christine Wall at Westminster, by Katie Lloyd Thomas at Newcastle. There are and the project on Ferro, and there's loads of stuff out there. But I think a particular and deliberately parochial look at these histories in our own context would be really worthwhile.
Good, thank you.
Could I add something to that really quickly? Sorry, Sam. But I do, and I know Ruth was lurking here earlier, but I do think that it would be great, certainly for our first years, if some of you might think about that for your critical practice manual, because if a number of you sort of explore different aspects of that program, of that question, we could actually really inform us here. And I'd be really happy to work a little bit, with you guys and with Ruth to think about how we could get those conversations going. I'm sure Charlie would be keen on it. And I'm sure we could drag the president of the RIBA into it as well, which would be good. So why don't you think about that, and we'll come back to it over the next few weeks.
Great. And any practices out there who are willing to participate in that, please do let us know. We have precisely 2 more minutes. I have one question here, one more, I think. Why, according to you, Neal, do we build big or massively? I think it means build. Do we build big? Why not something a little distributed, except for some obvious reasons of availability, ease of construction, and cost?
Yes, I mean, those are all good reasons. I think it is a question about industrialization also, and a kind of extractivist mindset. I mean, certainly I advocate and would like to advocate more aggressively, as I say, for how high technology can inform low technology, and smaller scale interventions. I don't think it's architects' fault. I think it's a bigger question about power, isn't it, and about capitalism, and as it were, about the clients of architecture. And maybe that will start to change as we start to redefine what the role of the architect actually is.
That is a fantastic place to end. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It is exactly 2:00, so I hope everybody has time to run around the block before they have to get back to work, or whatever it is you're doing next. Thanks so much, Neal, for taking the time and just opening up a whole wonderful hornet's nest of subject matter that we can get our teeth into for the next year, I would say, at least. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this week. I encourage you all, please, to return next week for Christophe Aigret of Studio Aigret West, who will be talking about placemaking, routing design from the ground up. So something completely different, possibly, but possibly could some links there too, no doubt. So please do join us, and welcome back next week. Look forward to seeing you then.